Thanks for being here tonight. Going out in a little bit of rain, but what a beautiful time of the year. And I don't know, who all has been out in the garden in the last few days? Pretty good, you know, maybe over half. Tomorrow will be awesome.
I'm excited.
I think the garden is at its apex right now in terms of fall color. It's sort of a sliding scale. It's gonna be great for several weeks really. And even into early November, lots of leaves have fallen, but it's still like really, really nice. And you can see transparency, and you can see branching structure, and there'll still be things with quite a lot of color out there. So yeah, come often until the end of the season. Just a few things happening out there. The Path of Pumpkins is revving up, and the pumpkins are arriving. 11 local schools have a pumpkin carving competition out there. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. There's going to be some pretty cool work out there. The Spooktacular, the Halloween event for kids, is coming up. That'll be a week from Saturday, and that's always a bunch of fun. There's information about that on the website. And also, following the Spooktacular, you'll have to make a reservation for this, but the moon viewing tea ceremony with Professor Kimiko Gunji from the University of Illinois, who's really the director of our Anderson Japanese Gardens Tea Study Group. She's our primary teacher and a marvelous teacher at that. So she'll conduct the tea ceremony. There'll be an ikebana demonstration while the moon viewing tea event is going on, but then there will also be an exhibition of ikebana with somewhere in the Catherine, eight or 10 ikebana practitioners.
Yep.
We'll be putting together pieces that will be on display up in the restaurant. So that's going to be really awesome. They're doing amazing work. And then also there'll be a shakuhachi player here from Chicago, also a tea sensei, Omar Francis sensei, and he'll play the bamboo flute as part of the moon viewing tea ceremony, sort of enhanced event. So that'll be really cool. The reason we're here tonight, I'm really happy to have Greg Wittkopp here. We thinking about those angels. I was here when they arrived and was a part of putting them together. And they were controversial to say the least, but I've come to enjoy them out there, and it's great to be able to know more about them. So met Greg through the North American Japanese Garden Association events for quite a few years now, actually, and he was here at the 2022 Kokoro event with Professor Gunji at the guest house. He started at Cranbrook in 1985, and so for 4 years before I started here, Greg was over there at Cranbrook. First as the curator and director of the Cranbrook Art Museum from 1985 to 2015. From 2012 to the present as the founding director of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. His responsibilities include the preservation of Cranbrook's collection of nearly 100 works by Carl Milles and leading the rehabilitation of the historic Cranbrook Japanese Garden. So really happy to have Greg here. I'm looking so forward to hearing about Milles and the angels and other sculptural works. So please welcome Greg Wittkopp.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be here. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Anderson this evening, and I'm going to tell you what I told them. This is my second visit to the Anderson Japanese Garden, and after my first visit, I came to think of it as, there are two gardens that are special in North America to me, you'll come to see why, but the Portland Japanese Garden and the Anderson Japanese Garden. And along with Catherine, made my first trip to Japan a year ago in November, and I was expecting that the gardens that I would see there would so blow me away that, somehow some of these special places here would, begin to pale in comparison. The Anderson Japanese Garden is, I can now say, is one of the most sublimely beautiful Japanese gardens anywhere in the world. It competes with the gardens of Japan. What you all have created here, what you tend, what you serve as docents for, is truly a very special place. So I am very honored. I'm very honored to be able to talk a little bit about the person that created 3 of the sculptures here at the Anderson Japanese Garden. I'm going to start out with just a few minutes, a little bit, what is Cranbrook? Where is Cranbrook? And then we're going to move into a film that we created about Carl Milles. I'm then going to talk a little bit about your angel musicians, a bit of their history, and then if you're still awake and have interest, I'll tell you a little bit about the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. So Cranbrook is located about 25 miles north of downtown Detroit. So we're in the northern Metro Detroit suburbs. Bloomfield Hills is our city. A 319-acre campus. So what does this campus all include? Well, historically, it grew out of first an elementary school. I guess there's a little bit of a lag here. Our founders, George and Ellen Booth, were deeply religious. They built an Episcopal church as part of the community. They then created a boys' school. They then created a girls' middle and high school. They added a natural history museum. And then they finally added an Academy of Art, a graduate art school, and an art museum. So collectively, all of these places now comprise what we call today Cranbrook Educational Community. We're one single organization, but with a really proud heritage of architecture, landscape, and design. Collectively, the entire campus is a National Historic Landmark. The Center for Collections and Research, my division at Cranbrook, we're kind of the public face of the architecture at Cranbrook, but in our care are actually 3 separate historic house museums. Our founder's house, Cranbrook House on the left from 1908, Saarinen House by the Finnish-American architect Elio Saarinen in the center, and a Frank Lloyd Wright designed Usonian house. But the story tonight is really focusing on the Academy of Art at Cranbrook, which has always been a graduate art school, no undergraduate program, founded in 1932. And we are especially going to focus on the first sculptor in residence. We call our faculty artists or sculptors in residence because they live at Cranbrook. They have their studio at Cranbrook. Their students live at Cranbrook. So bit of a fishbowl for some, but for others it is the perfect place to live and work. So with that, Tim is going to switch us to the film that we just created called Carl Milles, Beauty and Bronze. It's about 28 minutes long. And then we'll go back to some images at that point. He's much faster at this than I would have been.
Cranbrook. What began at the start of the 20th century as a private retreat for George and Ellen Booth, a home in the countryside north of Detroit, was slowly transformed by the visionary couple into a center of art, science, and education. First, George Booth designed the Meeting House, now Brookside School, where church services and nursery school classes were held by 1918. Then the Booths built Christ Church Cranbrook, with its soaring bell tower rising above the quickly changing landscape of farms transforming into suburban estates. As work on the church continued, the Booths established Cranbrook School for Boys, its charming quadrangles welcoming boarding and day students for classes in September of 1927. Across the valley, Ellen Booth's determined vision propelled the building of Kingswood School for Girls, dedicated in 1931, a place where young women studied and lived in an environment of exquisite beauty. The Institute of Science opened its doors to the public in 1938. Here, gems and minerals were displayed, flora and fauna studied, and the heavens observed. And the project closest to George Booth's heart, Cranbrook Academy of Art. Growing from a center of handicraft in 1928 to a powerhouse of art, architecture, and design by 1942, when the last major project of the Booths opened its doors, Cranbrook Art Museum. And it is here, as around the entire campus, that we find the architecture and landscape enhanced by the work of a singular genius, Carl Milles. George Booth, a metalsmith turned newspaper publisher, and Ellen Scripps Booth, heir to the fortune secured by the Detroit News, created Cranbrook through their vision and generosity. Embodying the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement, their home, Cranbrook House, exemplifies the edict to have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. In 1928, Booth set out to create his vision of an ideal artistic community, establishing the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios. Within these workshops, the blacksmith was hard at work, creating gates and andirons for the campus. The silversmith hammered out everything from chalices to cigarette cases. And the cabinet maker labored over elaborate furniture. And under the watchful eye of designer Loja Saarinen, skilled Swedish immigrant weavers executed rugs, window draperies, and textiles. The architect of these studios and the leader of this new enterprise that would evolve into Cranbrook Academy of Art was Eliel Saarinen, a renowned architect and designer who, at age 50, immigrated with his family from their native Finland to the American Midwest. In his first building for Cranbrook, the School for Boys, Saarinen demonstrated his guiding philosophy, his belief that the architect must, as he wrote, always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. What is particularly clear from Saarinen's early models of Cranbrook, there would be a great need for sculptures to adorn the buildings and grounds of this ambitious institution.
The story of how Carl Milles landed at Cranbrook is a fascinating one, a courtship, if you will, between the sculptor and his patron, George Booth. It was actually difficult for Booth to convince Milles to move from Sweden to Cranbrook. Milles was, after all, at the height of his fame. Milles's journey to becoming a sculptor was not a direct one. After a restless childhood in the late 1890s, he headed off for a new adventure in distant Chile to work at a Swedish gymnasium. Along the way, and luckily for all of us, he stopped in Paris and continued no further. With scant resources but innate talent, he began to practice sculpture and eventually became an assistant to the renowned French sculptor Auguste Rodin.
In 1905, he married the Austrian artist Olga Granner, known for portraiture, and the newlyweds soon moved to Sweden, where Karl's reputation as a sculptor started to grow. On a trip to America in 1929, George Booth welcomed the Swedish sculptor as a visitor to Cranbrook. Booth almost immediately invited Milles to join his growing community of artists as sculptor in residence, but Milles implied he was not interested. Still, Cranbrook so impressed him, he offered Booth a gift, his Triton fountain, and Booth, in return, purchased Milles's sun glitter. In Cranbrook archives, we can read the letters between the two men as they go back and forth for over a year. When Milles said he did not want to teach, Booth responded by telling him he would simply be expected to offer reasonable encouragement, counsel, and criticism. Booth then attempted to sweeten the deal, offering to purchase sculptures and promising ample studio space. While Milles increasingly came to believe that his future commissions and his future glory lay on this side of the Atlantic, he nevertheless still continued to resist Booth's offer. Negotiations ended with a curt ultimatum in a telegram from Booth to Milles. "We'll expect you after New Year's." The now or never demand worked, and Karl and Olga arrived in America in January of 1931. American critics took notice of his arrival. They referred to Milles as the heir to Bernini, famous for his fountains, while the largesse of George Booth was described in Life magazine as surpassing the princely courts of Renaissance Italy. Here, Milles was positioned as a rising sculptor in America, and Cranbrook Academy of Art as a leading center for arts education.
With Milles agreeing to relocate to Michigan, the Detroit News reported on the sculptor's impending arrival. It is hard to estimate the significance of the coming of Mr. Milles to America for a period of residence. For Mr. Milles is undoubtedly one of the outstanding figures in all contemporary art. When they arrived in early 1931, Karl and Olga Milles joined a growing cohort of immigrant artists and artisans at Cranbrook, including other Swedes like Tor Berglund, renowned for his furniture at Stockholm City Hall, who ran the Cranbrook cabinet shop, while his frequent collaborator in Sweden, weaver Maya Anderson Verde, came to America expressly to serve as the supervisor and a designer for Studio Loya Saarinen. Other Swedish immigrant weavers, all trained in Sweden's special handicraft schools in Stockholm or Bostad, provided the skills necessary to operate the Cranbrook looms. Some, like Lillian Holm and Ruth Ingvarsson, would have long careers teaching and weaving at Cranbrook. While these artists lived and worked in around the arts and crafts studios, Karl and Olga Milles moved next door to the Saarinens, into a newly completed home and studio with pride of place along Academy Way. This grand building served as both Karl Milles's American home and studio, and as a center of the Milles's rich intellectual and social life. To be a visitor to Milles's house was to step into the mind of the artist. In his living room, it was ancient sculptures, not furniture, that took pride of place. He called this his library and told visitors that Voltaire had 5,000 books, but I learn every day from my Greeks. As he described to one reporter, "I borrow from these works. Simplicity is the secret of fine sculpture, and these ancients knew it." His prized collection of ancient sculpture not only informed Milles's work, but served as the entertainment at elaborate teas and dinners. Coveted invitations brought students and visitors into Milles's domain, where, flashlight in hand, he spent hours with enraptured listeners, examining details of the statues and unraveling the mysteries of their form. His voice was low and musical, and speaking slowly, he would ask his visitors, "Have you ever seen a room like this?" Milles always ended his ruminations with a piercing glance at his audience and his favorite phrase, "Isn't it wonderful?" Arched doorways led out to the verdant courtyard, which, like the living room, was filled with ancient artifacts arranged by Milles. Summer lunches were served on Roman marble tables, and the conversation ranged, as one guest described, from classical myths and religion to the cosmos and love, Napoleon and Mozart, Turner's sunsets, and Rome's glories. The Detroit News reported that when the Swedish sculptor puts aside his work each afternoon, he wants hot coffee and good talk. The host likes laughter and pleases his guests with stories of the far-off places he has lived in and people he has known. Enchanting dinners took place in the glowing interior of the dining room, outfitted with paintings in soft pastels by Swedish artist Henning Malmström, and classically inspired furniture from Sweden's most celebrated maker, Carl Malmsten. Atop the table, hand-woven linens from Studio Loja Saarinen were embroidered with the Milles' monogram. Below, hand-knotted Rhea rugs designed by Milles and woven by Mrs. Saarinen's Swedish weavers tied the interiors together. While at the window, open-weave curtains framed views back toward the gardens. It was here, at home, where Milles could relax, philosophize, and study his beloved antiquities. But just steps away, behind the curtains, was where the real magic and passion of Carl Milles was on full display. Here, in his home studio, one of 3 workspaces Cranbrook provided its most eminent artists, was where Milles would begin new sculptures. He rarely started with sketches. Instead, he visualized the completed work and created a small clay model. This would be enlarged by one of Milles' many assistants to 1/3 of the size of the finished work. Milles then tackled the larger clay model, making anything from tiny changes to radical reforms. His team again mechanically enlarged the work to its final size, and once again, Milles pored over the sculpture, still not hesitating to incorporate new ideas. The completed clay model would then be cast in plaster and sent to the bronze foundry, usually the Royal Swedish Bronze Casting Company, led by Herman Bergman in Stockholm. Olga Milles too played a part in her husband's process, as remembered by Milles' student and friend, Svea Klein.
But you see, he would never leave his studio till Olga had come in and given him a critique. And he got very upset first, but then he came back and said, "Dear Olga, you were right. What you said was right."
In this vast main studio, some 100 feet long and 35 feet high, Milles could create at full scale his largest public commissions. While the magic of Milles' studio lay in the process of making, it was on the growing campus where one experienced the genius of the artist in full force.
What impresses me about the Carl Milles sculptures across Cranbrook are not just their individual beauty, but how, as a collection, they weave together the different parts of the campus. And it's no accident that every campus building designed by Eliel Saarinen features Milles' bronzes. It is one of the great architect-sculptor relationships in art history, though also one of the most unusual. You see, most of these sculptures weren't made for Cranbrook. George Booth orchestrated the expensive decision in 1934 to purchase some 41 sculptures, or 60 individual pieces, of Milles' work. The wholesale importation of a single sculptor's body of work meant that Saarinen was designing Cranbrook's campus with specific sculptures in mind. Here at the Art Museum, we experience a sophisticated arrangement of buildings, pathways, landscape, and sculpture. Europa and the Bull look out across the Triton pools, and this important axis seems to extend clear across the water into infinity. And the timeline of construction of this composition is really quite surprising. The sculptures were created in the 1920s, purchased in 34, and the Tritons installed in a formal garden designed by Loja Saarinen in 1935. Yet the pools weren't poured as concrete basins until 2 years later, when Europa and the Orpheus fountains were installed. And it was still another few years before the museum and library building was finally realized in 1942. While our eyes can look up and across the impressive front vista toward the museum, the building becomes all the more remarkable when you finally arrive. Here, Saarinen peppers sculptures by Milles and Milles' assistant, Marshall Fredericks, across the stairs and into the open peristyle in an irregular and highly original way. For instance, the Folkefilbeater sits on a plinth designed by Saarinen that matches the building's meandering stonework lines and geometric bronze doors. While the fountains and pools are grand and symmetrical, as you get closer to the museum, the sculptures become more intimate and conversational. We can look the Folkefilbeater directly in the eye and see the anguish as he searches for his abducted grandson. Nearby, Folkefilbeater appears again, this time at full scale, but just his torso, raised up high so his sharp gaze is looking down at us. He sits on an elaborate sculptural plinth, again with those stone meanders, and it's a composition that blurs the line between sculpture and architecture. Milles' work, then, is the art which Saarinen's monumental museum visually extols. The sculpture is not simply decoration applied to the building. Instead, the sculptures tie the campus together and inspires the entire creative enterprise of the Cranbrook vision.
As Eliel Saarinen said at the time of the 1934 purchase of Milles' sculptures, the acquisition of this collection will make Cranbrook one of the great beauty spots in this country and will add greatly to its importance as an art center. Indeed, everywhere on campus, Milles' work found sympathetic and harmonious positions. Milles sculpted figures from classical mythology like naiads, nymphs who guard over fresh water, or the chasing hounds of Diana, goddess of the hunt, or Pan, god of shepherds and music. And with playful streams of water that so entranced Milles, joyous mermaids and tritons. His passion for Scandinavian history is reflected in figures like Ingelbrek, the medieval Swedish warrior and liberator, or Sven Hedin, Swedish geographer and explorer. Milles was a lover of nature and gave as much attention to his animal figures as to the creatures that might latch onto them. Other animals are more than they first appear. The running horse was, as Milles wrote, a portrait of myself running without a rider. Religion provided further subject matter. Here, Milles dramatized the conversion of St. Paul and conveys the rich emotion of the subject through sinuous muscle, swirling fabric, and tight composition. And always, the power of each sculpture is enhanced through its architectural context. The Jonah Fountain stands as Milles' only sculpture at Cranbrook, made specifically for Cranbrook. As Milles wrote, Jonah was the first thing I started here at Cranbrook. When I started it, I didn't know what to do, but wanted to make a joke for the children. I thought it would be right to have Jonah appearing with a surprised look on his face. For its installation in the fall of 1932, Herman Bergman accompanied the fountain from his Stockholm foundry to Bloomfield Hills. He directed the crane operator, who swung the enormous fountain into place and oversaw the connections of 80 small pipes to jubilantly spray jets of water from the fishes and whale. Jonah was, in fact, commissioned for the courtyard of Kingswood School for Girls, a location deemed too small for this monumental fountain. Instead, the dramatic entrance of Kingswood frames Diana, the lyrical dancing goddess. Generations of Cranbrook students have looked out of their sprawling school toward the dancing girls, flitting toward the sky aside Kingswood Lake. Beyond his sculptures here, Milles had a special place in the life of Kingswood students. On unforgettable field trips across campus, the young girls visited Milles in his studio. The class of 1949 even elected to have Milles serve as their honoree for their class ring ceremony, which then took place in Milles's grand studio. Kingswood also served as the backdrop for Milles's memorable 70th birthday celebration, a chance for the community to gather together in celebration of its great sculptor and artist in residence. Melinda Booth, granddaughter of George and Ellen, helped ring in Milles's 7th decade. As important as myth, history, and religion were to Milles, there were also great moments of levity in his work, as in his charming moose, sculpted around 1923 and installed many decades later in Brookside's Vlasic Early Childhood Center. One of Milles's most distinctly American sculptures, the Ice Princess, was inspired by a visit to Rockefeller Center's iconic skating rink. Sculpted at Cranbrook around 1948, this edition was cast in Sweden by the Herman Bergman Fine Art Bronze Foundry in 2012 for the new middle school for girls, ensuring every Cranbrook building holds a Carl Milles sculpture. And at the Art Museum, one of Cranbrook's most indelible images is Milles's iconic Orpheus Fountain, rising from a circular pool amid the mists and spray. This group is just a portion of a much larger fountain sculpted at Cranbrook for the Stockholm Concert Hall. Orpheus himself, the musician from Greek mythology, was never installed at Cranbrook as his enormous scale was thought to be too tall next to the museum's columned peristyle. Nevertheless, the ring of 8 figures embodies the best of Milles's work. A strong composition, dynamic forms and emotive faces, and a flirtatious combination of water, sculpture, sight, and sky.
Archives are what allow us to go beyond the physical buildings and sculptures on campus and understand the full story of this special place. Within the collections of Cranbrook archives, Carl and Olga Milles are represented in all manner of interesting ways. While we don't hold the complete archives of Milles, which are in Sweden, we treasure the sketches by Carl Milles that we do have, including a study of a bear for the unrealized spirit of the forest fountain, ceremonial bronze doors in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, sketched within letters to the building's architect, and one of my favorites, For God Our Father on the Rainbow. Originally, Milles titled the work, Lord on the Rainbow, Placing New Stars on Heaven. What I find most revealing within our holdings are the connections we see between Milles and his friends, co-workers, and students. Particularly, we can see the strong friendship between our founders and Milles in places like the inscribed monograph of Milles's work from the Booth Library, or the wonderful birthday card for Ellen's 80th birthday with sketches by Carl. We can see how Milles was not only a mentor, but developed lifelong friendships with students in a scrapbook assembled by Milles's Swedish-American student, Nona Suderlind. In the archives, we have oral history interviews with many of Milles's Cranbrook peers, including Marshall Fredericks, who was an assistant to Carl and instructor at Cranbrook, and went on to an illustrious career as a sculptor in Detroit.
The acid oxidizes the bronze, turning it to a light green. More applications of acid follow until the right depth of color enriches the great bronze casting. The Spirit of Detroit, a 16-foot bronze statue at the City-County Building. A statue that stands for all those ties which bind a city and its people together.
There's also Richard Askew, our photographer in the 30s. These tapes really breathe life into the written and photographic record.
He inspected everything. He looked at it and would discard it if it wasn't right. It wasn't what he wanted. It would just be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, you know, Senator, they had a vision, that they could visualize a complete concept.
Askew traveled the country photographing Millis's installations. As a result, the archives has wonderful documentation of projects in St. Louis, Delaware, New York, and elsewhere. It's really through these records that we can understand the life and impact of Millis on the story of Cranbrook, and more broadly on the history of sculpture. In addition to illuminating his artistic process, the breadth of our collection allows us to see Millis as a person and not simply as the creator of beautiful objects.
Carl and Olga Millis returned each summer to Millesgården, their home in Sweden, and where, in the twilight of his career, Millis moved permanently in 1951. As one observer of both sites wrote, Cranbrook is woods, lawns, and ponds. Millesgården is sky, cliff, and water. Cranbrook stands as a 300-acre composition of sculpture, nature, and architecture. A total work of art. While the daily life of those on campus is varied and ever-changing, the work of Millis stands eternal. Whether cast in bronze or carved in stone, these sculptures are anything but mute. Through the skill of Carl Millis, they are alive.
We actually made this film 2 years ago. We have an annual fundraiser that we call House Party, and 2021 was not the best May to have 300 of your closest friends at a party. So it was a virtual party. We had food delivered to our patrons all over Metro Detroit, gourmet dinner, and then we had them watching this film with their friends and other patrons. It worked quite well, but not a model that I care to go back to. So what I want to do now is move to Millesgården, and we'll talk a little bit about your angel musicians. So let me see if I'm not advancing here. So it might mean that we have to move one off. Remember how that?
How about, we'll start from current slide.
Okay.
Try that one.
That should work. Not yet.
Okay, switching here, but not there.
Remember, we had to pull it off the screen, and you closed out of the YouTube, right?
Yeah, YouTube's gone.
Okay.
Okay, so let me.
We can always just close it and.
Go like this.
All right, that. Yeah. Okay,
All
that's
right.
good. Okay, brilliant. So at the same time that he was working at Cranbrook, he had already established this magnificent home and studio in, just outside of Stockholm on an island called Lidingö that looks over the harbor of Stockholm, where I think there is a cast of every single sculpture that he ever made. Like Cranbrook, it is a total work of art with him designing the gates and many elements. This is his home and main studio here. The collection of antiquities, which you saw in the film, moved back with him to Stockholm, to Millesgården. They also have a big storage area where there are plaster casts that of just about all of the works. And it is from these then that additional casts can be made of Carl Millis's work. Using the same foundry that he used, the Herman Bergman foundry in Stockholm. It's quite an amazing process to see these bronze pours taking place. But I'm going to pause on this image here a little bit, which I hope looks a little bit familiar to all of you here at Anderson Japanese Garden. So, what is the story of your three musicians? So, it was originally a commission that Carl Milles received, and the details are a little foggy, but for a nursery or a nursery school in Philadelphia. The commission was for 5 of these angel musicians. One was playing a flute, another a panpipe, a clarinet, a tuba, and a trombone. So this is 1949, 1950. He's making them at Cranbrook in his studio there. The commission fell through, as sometimes these commissions did. And, you know, an artist doesn't ever want to see a work just, you know, go into the scrap bin. So he had 3 of there were 5 angels again. 3 of them he cast for Millesgården. One of them he cast, and it became part of a fountain in Kansas City. And the 5th one was cast and became part of a fountain in Falls Church, Virginia, at the National Memorial Cemetery. So 5 different angel musicians playing 5 different instruments. At Millesgården, they actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They have 2 of the flute players, and then 1 each of the other 4 musicians. So I thought it would be, I contacted the curator at Millesgården and received a wealth of information, including, I want to read what Carl Milles wrote about this commission. So he wrote this in 1953, you know, about 3 years afterwards. They are all boy angels, all making music, all bringing joy, happiness, and hope to all people, healthy or sick. All these angels have arrived from heaven, or if you do not believe in heaven, from the big, great, mysterious world we call the universe that surrounds us all over on all sides. These angels all came to me one night in my sleep. I was surrounded by them and heard the music. And this beautiful, Millesgården, you all have to make a pilgrimage there sometime. It is a really beautiful place, high up on a cliff, overlooking the harbor. And I'm just showing you a little glimpse of the place. So in 1955, when another version of the angels were going to be installed, Carl Milles wrote a poem about them. So, and I'm going to share this with Tim and Catherine, so that as you look at your 3 musician angels here, you can think of this. Today you play the flute to us assembled here. May you often come to this our village and often play for pleasure, that you may joyfully report to heaven, and God will smile when he hears you. So, that ends my Milles talk. I have some more slides in my deck about the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. You know, if you're game for about another 10 minutes, I can do that. And then we can take questions if you feel like that at the end. So, the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. One moment in time here. This is the way it looked at about the time that the Booths were thinking most intensely about it. This is a work in progress, one that they were developing at the same time that they were building their own estate. before they turned the estate into the collection of educational buildings that you saw referenced in the movie. This is one corner of the garden today. This was the first phase of a multi-phase project that we are undertaking to rehabilitate, rejuvenate, and I don't really want to use the word restore, because although the history of the garden goes back a long time, what we're doing is, I often think of completing what George and Ellen Booth started, but never completed themselves. So the story goes back to George Booth as they're building their estate here. And I love to see Cranbrook when there were no trees yet. This was a rundown farm when they bought it. This is, an aerial view again with in red showing the area that would become the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. In 1914, it was still considered a rock garden. And so it was being built at the same time that they were adding terraces around their house, grottos on the grounds, a Greek theater. We still have a Greek theater at Cranbrook. And inspired by a trip to Lake Como in Italy, an Italian-inspired boathouse. Now, I like to think that maybe the great collector of Asian art, Charles Freer, who bought Whistler's famous Peacock Room, moved it to Detroit before it moved back to Washington, D.C., where it is now located. There's actually very little connection between George Booth and Charles Freer. Instead, the story really starts in 1915 in both San Francisco and San Diego. In 1915, you might know that the Panama Canal had just opened. And of course, that was this watershed moment, because suddenly the cultures of the globe were much more connected. So to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, two great World's Fairs, if you will, one being held in San Diego and one being held in San Francisco. And it was there that the Japanese government had a major presence with tea houses and pavilions and gardens. George and Ellen Booth traveled with George's father, Henry, out to see those, in part so that they could report on them in the Detroit News, their main newspaper. But while they were there, they were so inspired by Japanese culture that they paid a visit to Yokohama Nursery in San Francisco, bought several large Japanese plants, a wisteria, Japanese yew, umbrella pine, as well as then this Kasuga lantern, brought them back to Cranbrook and began transforming this rock garden slowly into what, at that time I think would be best to say was a Japanese-inspired garden. These bronze cranes were bought from the Gump department store in San Francisco on that same trip. So this is about the state at which the garden was when they put it off to the side and said, we now have to focus on art museums and schools and science institutes. And really this, it never, under the Booth's tenure, never went any further than this. So what might have inspired a much more naturalistic garden like this? Well, in part, there were a lot of Japanese, they never traveled to Japan, but there were a lot of Japanese books that were circulating at that time, including one that had images of Muranan in Kyoto, designed by Uichi. And it's this type of naturalism, which was evident in Japan at that time, that they were most interested in looking at. There was also an important book published in 1912 by Harriet Osgood called Japanese Gardens, and it included these watercolors Again, showing a much more naturalistic vision of what a Japanese garden might be. I show a picture of Muranon from a year ago, the day that Catherine and I were there, and actually that's the exact same spot that historic photograph was taken almost 100 years earlier. George Booth was, voraciously clipping out images that he would find in magazines, putting them in what he called his inspiration book. This happens to be of a Japanese garden in New Jersey at that time, the one built for Charles Pfizer, the pharmaceutical scion, called Yamados, which, if you spell that backwards, is someday. So someday spelled backwards becomes Yamados. And you see this garden that is, not unlike what George and Ellen were creating in Cranbrook. Very different than the Anderson Japanese garden. Well, this garden waxed and waned over the years to the point that, it was renamed the Oriental Garden during World War II. Nobody in the U.S. wanted to have a Japanese garden in the middle of World War II. And by that point, it was so overgrown that it's been said that this man here discovered the garden, amongst all of the overgrown plants there. The Casa de Lantern, however, has never left. It's always been kind of the cornerstone of the garden. So our journey, I know that you're very familiar with Kendall Brown, right here. I got to know him, invited him to Cranbrook, and he began our journey towards thinking about what the possibilities of our garden would be. We hired a landscape architecture firm in Ann Arbor, Quinn Evans, that created a very detailed historic landscape study of this area. We restored the Japanese-inspired bridge that was always historically in this garden. And then we ultimately decided to commission Sadafumi Uchiyama, who has been the curator in charge of the Portland Japanese Garden, to create a master plan for us. We decided that we would focus initially on this area that we call the Lily Pond Cascade, which, take note, do not plant Japanese butterbur. They can be very lush and beautiful, but quickly, with these giant leaves, they will take over. We are still trying to root them out because they spread by their tubers underground. But this was the area of this Lily Pond Cascade. We received a grant from the Japanese government, and they hired to work with Sada, a very important Japanese designer, Terashita, who began then sketching about what his ideas for this Lily Pond Cascade could be. He and Sada both were selecting many of the stone elements for it over a 6-day period, 6 days only. All of the work was done here, including the creation of a Yamadoro, a mountain lantern. The ribbon cutting took place in October, this same month, in 2018, so exactly 5 years ago, and another glimpse of what that butterbur overgrown area became at the end of this project here. So where are we at today? Sada has created a master plan for the entire garden, and next up, in fact, we are going to begin construction on this in April of this coming spring. We are going to be putting into place what we're calling the new entrance garden. Meanwhile, we are part of a natural river system, the Rouge River, which, if any of you have heard of Henry Ford's famous River Rouge plant, we are the headwaters for the same river that flows by that plant. And yes, You know, it used to be once every 30 years, then it was once every 10 years. We're at the point now about once every 3 years. We have, you know, one of these torrential deluges, but we've actually gone pretty good at, you know, devising some ways that we can channel the water, because as Sada always says, you know, you're never gonna win with water. It only obeys gravity, and so somehow you have to work with that gravity. So I'll end with this image here of the Japanese inspired bridge, and then take you back to the first image here. And for any of you that are interested, I'm more than happy to answer questions about Cranbrook, Carl Milles, or our Japanese garden. Thank you very much. Any questions out there?